And we begin with those who fought and died for freedom. War veterans and leaders came together today in northern France to commemorate the 80th anniversary of D-Day. U.S. President Joe Biden and French President Emmanuel Macron led the main ceremony, remembering this date, June 6, 1944. That's when Allied soldier troops landed on the beaches of Normandy to begin the liberation of Western Europe from Nazi Germany. It was the biggest seaborne invasion in history. Now, U.S. President Biden said that the anniversary comes at a critical time for the nations that took part.
We're living in a time when democracy is more at risk across the world than any point since the end of World War II, since these beaches were stormed in 1944. Now we have to ask ourselves, will we stand against tyranny, against evil, against crushing brutality of the iron fist? Will we stand for freedom? Will we defend democracy? Will we stand together? My answer is yes, it only can be yes.
Well, I'm joined now by Daniel Todman. He's a professor of modern history at Queen Mary University in London. Professor, it's good to have you on the program. The lessons of D-Day. What would you say are the main lessons that could help us better navigate the challenges that we face, not in 1944, but rather in 2024?
Thanks. A good question. I'd think of this as being an event that's about an international battle, one that's fought by an alliance that had to come together and surpass its differences of opinion, differences of really profound differences of politics and ideology, in order to achieve something that was a collective goal. So, there's a powerful lesson there for thinking about how we confront problems in the future.
When you look at the pictures, the images of the commemorations today, the average age of those attending, they were advanced. They looked to be, the high 70s, maybe. Most of the veterans were around 100 years old. Has World War II, has it lost its ability to captivate the imagination of younger generations? Has too much time passed?
Well, that's the thing about the past, that it does get further away. But I think fundamentally that conflict is one of ideologies and ethics. And in my experience, young people today are as motivated by the big ideas as they ever have been. Of course, as we get further away from an event in time, public knowledge can fade. But the latest survey results that I've seen from Britain and from elsewhere in Europe suggest that actually, it's still quite a high percentage of people recognising what D-Day was, knowing something about it.
These commemorations, this 80th anniversary, it comes just days before hundreds of millions of Europeans are going to vote in the EU elections. They're going to choose a new European Union parliament. The polls are predicting a wave of support for the far right, the likes of which Europe has not seen in decades. Do you think that those who sacrificed their lives at Omaha Beach, do you think they're turning in their graves now?
I think I'd be very careful about presuming the contemporary political attitudes of people who served during the Second World War. It's important to remember that lots of those American soldiers, or all of them, have come from a country which was racially segregated. I think the key thing is that they were fighting for democracy. That was a strongly shared value, a sense of something that was combining people at the time. And the point about these elections is that they are democratic. It's an enormous democratic moment. Now, people may or may not like who's standing in those elections or their attitudes or all that sort of thing, but that's the point about democracy. The people get a choice.
There was a story today about a 102-year-old World War II veteran from the U.S. who died on his way to attend the D-Day ceremony in France. It made some of us think, what happens when the generation that bore witness to the horrors of World War II is no longer among us? My grandfather was a veteran of World War II. That generation is quickly fading away.
Yes, mine too. I think there's what we see historically is that there's a key difference between not so much the passing of the veterans generation, but actually the passing of their children. So I think we've still got some time in which these anniversaries still retain their power to have a big hold on the public imagination. So while there are still people alive who met veterans, who were their descendants, then that's something that's the past still seems very close. The point where you really see a change, and we've gone through that point with the First World War now, is when you get to the point where it's 2 generations on. So there's none of that connection anymore. And that point will come as it comes for all historical events. And ultimately, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing if we get to a point where we're not thinking about that conflict as much as we do now. If the other side had won, we'd be thinking about it more.
What about the comparisons that we tend to make? Western leaders, they've accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of being a modern-day figure similar to what Adolf Hitler was in the Second World War. Is that a fair comparison?
I think as a historian, I'd always be wary about making simplistic comparisons. I think it's notable that I haven't seen any evidence from any of those Western countries of an active effort to exclude or dismiss the Soviet Union's contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany. What there's clearly been a political decision that, in the context that we're in at the moment, it's not appropriate to invite the President of Russia to participate in these commemorations. And to the extent that his actions have been characterised by aggression, then I think that's appropriate.
I want to ask you before we run out of time, when you look at the course of human history, war and conflict, they appear to be the norm. Peace seems to be the exception in many cases. The past decades have been exceptionally peaceful. Do you think our moment in history will go down as just that, as an exception? I mean, have we experienced an anomaly in the long span of human history?
Well, we have. I mean, I'd point out that that's particularly true if you live in northwestern Europe. For lots of other people, recent decades haven't been characterised by peace. It seems unlikely that period of peace is going to continue in the same way that it has done. I'd also say, though, that one of the things that anybody studying these wars takes away from them is the power of human resilience and the capacity to survive. So I might be pessimistic about in the future, but I'm optimistic about humans.
Well, and as we say many times, those who forget history are condemned to repeat it. So it's good that people like you are teaching us history. Professor Daniel Todman, we appreciate your time and your analysis on this historic day. Thank you.
We're joined now by DW correspondent Sonia Phalnikar, who is also in Normandy, in the city of Caen. Sonia, President Biden was very direct in his speech in reaffirming America's commitment to the defense of Ukraine, wasn't he? Tell us more about what he said.
That's right. I mean, President Biden delivered those remarks at the American Cemetery in Colville-sur-Mer here in Normandy. This is a cemetery which contains nearly 10,000 graves of American victims of the battle for Normandy. And President Biden, drew strong parallels between the past and the present. He talked about the war raging in Europe again, the ongoing Russian invasion of Ukraine now in its third year. And he said that, basically the struggle of Ukrainians, he said, captures the spirit of D-Day. It echoes the struggle for freedom. And he cast the conflict as being part of an unending struggle between what he called dictatorship and freedom. He pledged that NATO and the wider kind of pro-Ukraine international alliance would stand by Ukraine and not walk away. And this was essentially President Biden reaffirming the transatlantic relationship, reaffirming America's commitments to NATO, which has, of course, underpinned, decades of security and prosperity in Europe. And of course, that reaffirming of Western solidarity, a show of Western support and resolve, if you like, is also comes at a time when there are concerns mounting among European leaders that they may not be able to take this for granted anymore. There are concerns that the possible election of President Trump in presidential elections in November, there are worries about what that could mean for the transatlantic relationship, whether that could undermine America's contributions to NATO. This is a defense alliance that was set up in the wake of World War II and has served, as the bedrock of European security.
Sonia, tell us what else is happening in Normandy today as part of these commemorations.
Well, earlier today we saw the British, the US and Canadians holding kind of their own separate ceremonies to honor their troops and their contributions and sacrifices. And now this afternoon we're going to see another big international ceremony presided over by French President Emmanuel Macron at Omaha Beach. Now this is one of the 5 beaches in Normandy where Allied forces came ashore 80 years ago. And this is where American forces suffered massive losses when they came under German fire. More than 2,000 Americans died on D-Day alone. And President Macron will be hosting world leaders, the leaders of the US, Britain and Canada, of course, but also the leaders of countries and other countries that contributed to the D-Day landings. Countries like Australia, Belgium, Norway, Denmark, Poland, all these leaders will be present there. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz will also be at the Omaha ceremony, kind of representing the vanquished enemy in a show of Europe's reconciliation.
Sonia, thank you so much for that. That's DW correspondent Sonia Phalnikar reporting from the city of Caen in Normandy. And DW reporter William Glucroft joins me now in the studio for more on what's happening in Normandy. Welcome, William. What stood out for you in particular in what we heard from President Biden today? Because he was quite pointed in certain remarks, wasn't he?
Right. He's continuing a theme of his administration, which is a very simplified view of the world that puts democracies versus autocracies or democracies versus authoritarian systems. And World War II is the perfect parallel to be able to make that very simplified case. And D-Day in particular, because D-Day was this very salient, singular point in time that really was, 150,000 mostly men storming beaches into one of the most deadliest and dangerous combat situations ever seen to liberate Europe. And many of them paid the ultimate price for that. Of course, history has a way of smoothing out the complications and smoothing out some of the less nicer bits of history, right? Democracies aren't just good and autocracies aren't just bad. Even at that time, World War II, the democracies we're talking about, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, were also colonial empires, or in the U.S. case, had Jim Crow laws and segregation. So they had their own racial and ethnic divisions and injustices to deal with, both during and after the war. And we see that again today with democracies picking winners and losers, right? We heard Joe Biden's strong case again today for supporting Ukraine. At the same time, people around the world, leaders and protesters, are looking at what's happening in Gaza and saying, well, wait a minute, these are two different standards you're applying. So it's as complicated then and messy then as it was today, but D-Day is a time to really distill these very overarching themes of freedom that Joe Biden brought out in his speech today.
Standing united. As you said, there was a real reaffirmation of Western solidarity in what he said. You mentioned Russia, Ukraine. There is a war happening in Europe again now. Tell us more about the points he was making about the war in Ukraine.
Biden wants to make the case that we're better together than we are apart, just as the Western allies were on D-Day, before there was a NATO, then during the Cold War as a formal NATO alliance, and now trying to renew that alliance through the context of Ukraine by having not just NATO allies, but I think as many as 50 countries are part of this broader Ukraine coalition, providing weapons and resources and support and financial aid for Ukraine, and making the case that just as, and I believe Joe Biden, I'm paraphrasing, but Joe Biden basically said, just as the veterans sitting behind him paid the ultimate price and fought for freedom, then so too must democracies stand up now and do maybe not the same thing, because it's not U.S. and British and French boots on the ground facing Russian ones, but in a similar vein, step up to the political challenges of staring down Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Absolutely. And obviously, in a year where we're going to be seeing a US election and there may not be a President Biden next year, there may be a President Trump talking about all these themes, NATO and the reaffirming Western solidarity. President Biden is really trying to push his view here, isn't he?
Yeah, he's trying to set a tone whether he wins or loses. We all know Donald Trump's less friendly views on NATO and traditional Western allies. That said, we're a long way, even if Trump were to win, we're a long way from NATO dissolving. It is a treaty-bound legal alliance. Congress would have its say, and Trump aside, there is strong bipartisan support for maintaining that alliance and for maintaining NATO. And for as much as there is a, shall we say, a readjustment in the American desire to be involved in the world, it's not the same thing as necessarily isolationism or protectionism, more of a rebalancing. It could be isolationism and protectionism, but we don't quite know yet what a U.S. might be as there is this call, both in the U.S. and out, of sort of stepping back a bit or rebalancing American power in the world.
Mm-hmm. But certainly today, standing united and remembering what happened 80 years ago. William Glucroft, thank you so much.